everybody. Welcome to the latest of the National Association of Scholars webinars on Great American Literature. I'm David Randall, Director of Research and your moderator. And I am delighted to have, for our discussion of James Fenimore Cooper's The Last of the Mohicans, three distinguished panelists. They are in alphabetical order by last name. Dr. Stephen Harthorn, who is chair of the Department of English and Literature and professor of English at the University of Northwestern, St. Paul, among other things, is the executive director for publications and corresponding secretary for the board of the James Fenimore Cooper Society. Dr. Doreen Alvarez Saar is professor of English in the Department of English and Philosophy at Drexel University, and also serves as American Literature Editor of the Rocky Mountain Review of Language and Literature, and past president and current board member of the East Central American Society for 18th Century Studies. Dr. Craig White is Professor Emeritus of Literature at the University of Houston Clear Lake, and among other things, author of the Student Companion to James Fenimore Cooper. Now, there should be plenty of their publications showing up in the chat or the Q&A screen at some point. You are encouraged to follow the list to the Amazon links and buy broadly and plentifully from all of their combined oeuvres. We will be discussing, conversationally, the speakers on prompts. What makes The Last of the Mohicans a great American novel? How has the novel influenced American depictions of frontiersmen and American Indians? Who influenced Cooper's writings and who did his writings influence? How would you describe his place in American literature? And I will say, we have not gone in chronological order in our webinar series. So we're actually getting to Cooper, more than halfway through, frankly, I should say. But he is obviously at the start of the great American literature tradition, or darn near the head of it, if not at it. So this will be sort of a wonderful getting back to the beginnings of what makes the great American novels. Now, I just want to say briefly about how this is done. 12 to 14 minutes conversational talk by each alphabetical order, then questions and answers by you, the digital audience. Please put your questions into the chat and the Q&A buttons, where you will then have these either relayed by me in some order or answered directly by the panelists, who can also respond directly to one another, for good conversation. It's not all going to be regimented or anything. No question will be left unanswered. If we get to the end of our session and your question has not been answered, and I don't do them in chronological order, just whatever seems like a fun question to continue a conversation, send your questions to me at randall@nas.org, RANDALL@nas.org, and I'd be delighted to forward your questions to our panelists so that they have the option to answer you. And if you have to leave suddenly in the middle, don't worry. This is being recorded on the National Association of Scholars YouTube channel. Should be up within 24 hours, and you will be able to look at this at any point if you have to dash and run. Having said all that, Professor Harthorn, may I ask you to speak first?
Gladly. Thank you so much. I think it stands as one of the great ironies in the literary history of the United States that James Fenimore Cooper undertook the novel that would become The Last of the Mohicans at the suggestion of an English nobleman. Cooper and some others, a party of British aristocrats, were touring around the area of Glen Falls, New York, and in that town, there's a large island outcropping of rock that has caves in it. And Cooper and these British gentlemen were exploring it. And essentially, one of the gentlemen in the party observed that this would be the perfect scene for Cooper to set one of his romances. And that gentleman was actually a man named Edward Stanley, who would go on to become Lord Derby, who was 3 times the Prime Minister of England. But Cooper, in response to this, basically said, I think I should set one of my old Indians here. And we're not really sure exactly what he meant. Up till this time, Cooper had written a little bit about Native Americans in his first leather stocking tale, The Pioneers, which came out in 1823. There he had an Indian named Indian John. We find out his Indian name was Chingachgook. And it turns out that really he's past his prime. He ends up dying in the novel. He's given over to alcoholism. He lives this kind of womanish old age that sees him really degraded from the glorious past that he once had. And that's sort of the first impression that we get. But in The Last of the Mohicans, Cooper really takes us back to the prime of Chingachgook and his he's sort of the sidekick of Natty Bumppo, the leather stocking, who becomes Hawkeye in The Last of the Mohicans. And Cooper sets us in the French and Indian War in an area not far, much of the action taking place either around Glens Falls or up the river toward Lake George by Fort William Henry, and really kind of transforms, whereas the Pioneers had been a very descriptive story. The Last of the Mohicans is adventurous and drawing a little bit perhaps on Indian captivity narratives. Cooper creates this really exciting adventure that involves a whole pursuit narrative as Hawkeye, Chingachgook's son Uncas, and others end up trying to take this party from Fort Edward up to Fort William Henry. So, one of the achievements I think Cooper really made in this story, compared to the Pioneers, which is a very descriptive story, very episodic, not a lot of action going on, is he created something that would resonate with generations of readers as sort of a frontier adventure story. And the dimensions of that would go on later in the 19th century. This novel was hugely influential when later authors of dime novels kind of picked up on the theme. They tended to distill out the adventure from Cooper's stories and the white and red men kind of aspects of it, but lost a little bit of what Cooper was doing. So, in later imitations, you'd get many adventurous scenes. Native Americans were often portrayed unfavorably in those, but Cooper was doing something much more serious and much more philosophical. And I find that to be one of the really fascinating dimensions of the novel that maybe many of the followers that came after him ended up missing. One of the things I think Cooper does really well in The Last of the Mohicans is explores the issue of cultural memory. And I like to think of Last Mohicans in some way as being kind of an alternative history. And, today you can read books by Harry Turtledove or other people that give kind of alternate takes on World War II. What if the Nazis would win the war or something like that? Cooper's not going quite that far in creating an alternative reality in The Last of the Mohicans. And yet, I think one thing that's really interesting is that he gives us sort of a prospect of what could be or what could have been in America. And if you read all the way through to The Last of the Mohicans, it's a novel that ends in sadness and ends in lament and sort of a sense of carrying on, even though great things have been lost. And so I wanted to just speak a little bit about some of Cooper's achievement in that regard and what he ends up doing there. Cooper's got a variety of Native American characters in the book, and they end up taking both sides in the French and Indian War. And to some extent, whether they're good guys or bad guys, so to speak, depends a little bit on whether they're on the British side or the French side. But it's more largely an issue of character. And one of the interesting things in the book is that Cooper has various characters. The main villain in the story is really this treacherous Indian named Magua. And yet the heroes, Chingachgook and his son Uncas, end up standing out and are really, really very favorable kinds of portrayals. And we see a number of others in between, the aged warrior Tamanund, that's now, probably about a century old and the chief of his tribe, and others along the way. And, Cooper, though he talked about his old Indians, wasn't necessarily an expert. He had encountered them a little bit during his childhood on the frontier in Cooperstown, New York, but wasn't in daily contact, didn't know the populations well. He relied a fair amount on the works of a Moravian missionary named John Heckewelder, who was a Moravian who worked among the tribes, especially the Delaware, and described many of them. And so Cooper built a lot off of things Heckewelder did. And I think if you read what Cooper wrote later about the last Mohicans, he tried to strike the kind of portrayal that you might find in more epic kinds of works. If you read the Iliad or the Odyssey, there's a kind of bigger than life, idealized sort of way of looking at the world. And Cooper wanted to be both true to history, but also have some of that, what he would call the beau ideal, the favorable ideal of these characters, and really portray Native Americans well. One interesting thing I find in that regard, as he's taking us through the last of the Mohicans, through the adventure and the pursuit, there's various stops along the way. And one of these fascinating moments in there is when the party ends up stopping for a night at an abandoned blockhouse. And this was sort of a remnant of some old war in the past, some old skirmish on the frontier. It's dilapidated, broken down, becoming overgrown. It's essentially kind of melting back into the forest. And as the party spends the night there, for one thing, they realize they're on ground where others have been killed and buried. But of course, there aren't grave markers in the traditional sense. It's kind of reverting back to wilderness. And as Hawkeye and the white party are kind of bedding down for the night, Chingachgook and his son Uncas end up walking around, and Chingachgook basically shares various accounts of the skirmish there, what happened. And it's a very fascinating moment because we are essentially dealing with a moment that's not passed down in written history, but is being transmitted orally. And Cooper's very interested in this kind of process of retaining knowledge. And he was very interested in the fact that, especially for these cultures of the Native Americans, one of the risks would be that their culture would disappear kind of without a trace. And so this oral heritage is something that he builds into the book as kind of an alternative way of reckoning with things. White settlers have their own way of documenting their history, but so do the Native Americans as well. It's a very, very respectful moment that Cooper had that I think is just magic in there. Later on in the next chapter, as they approach Fort William Henry, they come upon a place called the Bloody Pond. And this was another place where a skirmish had once occurred. You can still visit it in upstate New York. And it was a pond where after the casualties of battle took place, the dead were pushed into the pond, and it became kind of the burial ground of those who had fought in that skirmish. And if you think a little bit about what's going on in that moment, here's a pond where, if you throw something into a pond, the waters are disturbed for a moment, the ripples will go out, but then before too long, it settles back, and you would have no idea that that stone had been thrown in there just a few minutes ago. And Cooper is kind of commenting in that way about, the fact that tremendously awful things could happen, that brutality, skirmishes, bloodshed could all take place here on the frontier. And yet you don't see the traditional kinds of markers and milestones and memorials of that. And in a way, Cooper, I think, is sort of playing with the idea that in America versus old Europe, the civilization on the continent that sort of sets the standard, things are different in America, and they have their own different way of operating, and especially for the Native Americans, and those in the past, even in America's past, there's that concern that things have kind of vanished without a trace, or might vanish without a trace, and we'll be left without that very important cultural memory and all the lessons that come from that. At the close of the book, spoiler alert, the two brave characters in the novel, Uncas, the Native American warrior, and Cora, who is the braver of the two Monroe sisters, though a mulatto, both end up dying. And some critics have commented on this, wondering if this was Cooper's, sort of passing judgment against racial mixture, killing off these characters as a judgment against that sort of thing. If you look to some of Cooper's other novels, like his 1829 book, The Wept of Wish Done Wish, you'll find that Cooper actually has there an interracial white Indian romance that he seems to allow for there. So I think what's going on at the end of the book is really something different, not so much Cooper expressing his judgment against the mixing of races, but what we see again is the loss of the two greatest characters, other than maybe Hawkeye, in the book. It's really kind of a commentary on what America ends up losing. You know, he puts up this alternative reality of sorts, this possibility that we might have an America where the races can mix, where we might have harmony and intermixture and cultural exchange that works according to much more favorable kinds of principles. But instead, what we're left with is the aftermath where the white characters, Duncan Hayward, the British soldier, Alice Munro, the sort of weaker blonde sister in the book, they're kind of left to pick up the pieces, and they're good people. But we get a sense that really we're left in this kind of state of mourning, this sort of elegy, almost as it were, for what America has lost in that process. I think in that way, one of the great values for us, even now, of The Last of the Mohicans is thinking about that kind of sense of what America not only might have been, but I think Cooper holds that up as the prospect for what might be, what could be, if people approach things well.
Sorry, are you at an end there?
I can be, sure.
Sorry. There was just a pause. Sorry, do you want to go on or?
No, I think I simply would want to say in that regard, Cooper met with a lot of critical controversy during his day, that there were those who thought he portrayed Native Americans far too favorably. And then others that, today, of course, one of the complaints is that Cooper's speaking from a less than authentic position. I talked to somebody a couple years ago from the Mohegan Stockbridge tribe, sort of the remnants of people portrayed in the novel. And they have very mixed feelings. This person said, at least, that there were very mixed feelings about the kind of portrayal that Cooper had, that it wasn't true to life, or that he was stepping in as somebody who really couldn't speak authentically for their experience. But in his own day, Cooper met with a fair amount of acclaim from other Native Americans. And for instance, a Native American journalist named George Copway said that no living writer had done so much justice to the noble status of the Native American. So in that sense, Cooper left kind of a controversial legacy in his own time about sort of the role and the place of Indians. But I think for us leaves an interesting way to kind of contemplate anew, even though he's not speaking as a thoroughgoing expert on Native Americans, the kind of portrayal he gives us artistically gives us a lot to work with as we think about cultural interaction and the heritage that we draw from that.
Thank you. Sorry, and not to have interrupted you before. Just,
no,
there was a pause. I just didn't want
absolutely.
it to be.
Didn't want to go over my time.
Anyway, look, thank you so much. That's wonderful. And I will go on to the next of our panelists, Dr. Saar. May I ask if you would go next? Oh, and you're still muted.
I am not a Cooper expert. I am an Americanist, and my training is largely in the 18th century. But what I did for this project really, and I wanted to take as my cue something that Cooper says in The Last of the Mohicans, which is, history, like love, is so apt to surround her heroes with an atmosphere of imaginary brightness. And he says this about about Montcalm and the problem with the massacre at Fort William Henry. And I think this is good for us to look at the whole notion of Cooper's reputation. And I think one of the things that most people don't understand is that when we think of modern literary reputation, we really think of a place in institutional learning. We think of where does someone fit in something that's set out by our educational institutions. But in fact, when Cooper starts out, there is no such thing. His reputation as such is determined by people who write for magazines, who are local, often represent different interests, so that you do not have the kind of notion that we think of as reputation really developing until much later when you have academic judgments. Now, one of the things that made Cooper, in his time, Cooper was a best-selling author, and that in itself, and he sold in England, which was incredibly important for Americans. To be a bestseller in England was really to capture a population that Americans did not believe they could. You know, someone said, who reads an American book at this time? So by the time of Cooper's death in 1852, his reputation, even among critics, has declined. He's been delegated to children's literature. They find him not a good stylist. Now, at the same time, what you have in America is really no literary studies as we understand it. So it's really not, if you went to university at all, you would study Greek and Latin. So it's not until the 1870s that you begin to even have courses in American literature. And the first person that really writes about this is a fellow named Charles Richardson, who publishes a 2-volume work on American literature, which is the first attempt of a comprehensive study of American literature. In that, he spends very little time on Cooper, saying, let no one go to Cooper as to Harthorn for instruction in the arts of style. So one of the early commentaries academically about Cooper is that he's just not a stylist. But in Richardson's largely biographical description of Cooper, in his primer of American literature, is actually more helpful and prophetic in telling us how discussions of Cooper are going to go. He says, the spy founded a multitude of admirers. This story, as well as the pioneers, was thoroughly national, and Cooper henceforth occupied as his own the field of wildlife in the West. So what you have early on is Cooper is an understanding that Cooper was not a stylist, but was identified heavily with the nature of America itself. So this becomes a kind of a standard judgment in Cooper's studies. Richardson goes on to say his novels were full of romantic interest and showed the public that American scenery and life furnished as good a foundation for fiction as the castles of Europe. Again, another claim that's very important in that period. And he goes on to say, Cooper was American through and through. And this theme of being American through and through is one that resonates through judgments of Cooper's reputation. However, what's very interesting, and what I'm going to try and point out in this sort of study of reputation, is that in each period, each critic really throws up material, extraneous or not, that is related to the nature and the tenor of that period. So what is Richardson concerned with? He says, rather than finding the originality of Cooper's subject compelling, he's concerned about the negative impression left on the English nation. Richardson says, from his writings, undoubtedly, a great part of the English public got the impression, which has been with difficulty corrected, that buffaloes and Indians form the most conspicuous feature of our civilization. Richardson is part of an America that wants to make America seem culturally equal to Europe. Further, Richardson finds that Cooper's founding of an original field problematic. Cooper virtually had the field to himself at first, and the novelty of his subjects aroused in his writings an interest which their intrinsic literary merits hardly warranted. In later years, a host of imitators have written more exaggerated Indian stories, which long formed the principal diet of the lower classes, though their popularity is now somewhat waning. So, in this period where we're trying to establish American literature as worthy of study in American universities, you have sort of contradictory confounding here of items. And layered, of course, on this issue is the issue that American literature as a whole has had to face in universities. It's a latecomer to study. It's considered not as important and not as significant. So what happens is you have a kind of defense of American literature that starts here. And then by World War II, World War I, more interest in American literature starts to come up. But Cooper is still largely consigned to the canonical notion that his novels belong to children and it's children's literature. And I brought for you this beautiful Wyeth for young readers that helped to sort of fund this notion with this. But what happens then is in the 1940s, Spiller, Thorpe, Canby, and particularly Robert Spiller begin to establish American literature as something worthy of study. American literature comes into its own. And with that, you have the rise, of course, of studies. Particularly D.H. Lawrence's study of classic American literature is one of the ones that catapults Cooper back into renown. And again, what happens, of course, is this is a national judgment. This is a judgment about, does Cooper represent the nation? How does he represent the nation? And Lawrence says, now let me put aside my impatience at the unreality of this vision and accept it as a wish fulfillment vision, a kind of yearning myth, because it seems to me that things in Cooper that make one so savage when one compares them to actuality are perhaps, when one considers them as presentations of a deep subjective desire, real in their way and almost prophetic. So the notion, particularly for Last of the Mohicans, as a fulfillment of a wish, a dream, someone called it a Midsummer Night's Dream of a novel, really becomes the way that Cooper is approached. And we no longer, we look at Cooper through that lens. And so the lens that Cooper represents the nation remains a kind of constant. And this, of course, is covered again in one of the most influential studies of the novel, Leslie Fiedler's Love and Death in the American Novel, that builds on the Lawrence ideal. And what happens is when Fiedler, and who I should, this is, what do they say? I should point out that I was, Leslie Fiedler was my dissertation director. So I'm not, I don't want you to say that, didn't want to hide that. But what Fiedler does is look at the national vision in terms of the great issues of the day, and that's race and gender, and lays out in that view of nationalism what the issues with the nation are. So that what we see is ensuing critical reviews still play on the same themes. So Donna Richardson's Cooper's revision of Paradise Lost and Romantic Satanism struggles with the same issues, arguing that Miltonic illusions represent a more consistent and cultural analysis. So Cooper becomes the signifier of the culture. And if you look at that, then the debates really turn over how do you read that culture? So Alan Taylor in William Cooper's Town reads Cooper through the lens of class and his relationship to the changing class issues of the period. So it's very interesting that in taking on the cloak of being part of the national myth, Cooper must always be at the mercy of how people feel about the national myth. So how people feel about America becomes, to some extent, an influential way of looking at Cooper himself. So this is not so much to say, to really talk about Cooper directly, but to say that he bears, in opening the myth of the nation, he bears the burden of the nation. And because I'm an 18th century person, I want to point out that Cooper is largely the product of many, many cultural strands that arise in the 18th century. So if we criticize Cooper, as Stephen suggests, that we criticize him for his stand on Native Americans, you realize that he is merely filtering through various cultural trends that are longstanding. So he is not merely coming to these on his own, but he is representing, reflecting, synthesizing issues that are there. So, for example, the sources, Stephen Randall writes an article called Cooper and His Sources, and talks about the three works that Cooper uses for his narrative of 1757, and talks about how those sources really emphasize the bloodthirstiness of the massacre at Fort William Henry. So when you see those, and when you see the fact that the captivity narrative, particularly that of Hannah Dunstan, which is in one of the sources, which is Timothy Dwight's travels, is reflected in this. So the brutality that we see in some of these instances are drawn from sources which are, if not directly historic, purport to be historic representations or eyewitness accounts of the events. Balanced against that, of course, you have things like the representation of the noble savage in people like Crèvecoeur, where, as D.H. Lawrence points out, that you have the innocent wigwam, you have the noble red man. And Crèvecoeur brings up, for the 18th century audience, the idea of Native American society as an alternative to the existence of, and to the problems of what he sees as America during the Revolution. So you have sort of balances here between what the funneled sources that are coming through in Cooper's vision. So Cooper, in some sense, if we find Cooper too responsible for them, we really are denying the fact that Cooper lived in history, and that that historical environment is in fact Cooper's environment, of which he's trying to make a kind of artistic sense. And that's an important, I think, recognition with this. Other pieces that I wanted to talk about is the problem of speech and the criticism of accuracy. The problem of speech and the recording of speech and how Native American speech really runs through all of the previous documents. So the most interesting version of this is Ledornier's notable record of voyages to Florida. And Ledornier records an example of how one of his people sat in the tent of an Indian and saw a ceremony going on and had no idea what was happening, and stood there watching, waiting, and hoping that it would turn out okay. And it does. But you have the 18th century and the 17th century experience with peoples who are entirely foreign to them, whose speech they cannot understand, whose speech is in fact inflected and refracted through their own notions of what appropriate speech is. One of the sort of classic examples of this occurs, of course, in John Smith's recording of his encounter with Powhatan. The language that he puts into Powhatan's mouth at this point is exalted. It is subtle. It is characteristic of English courtly speech. At one point, this elevates Powhatan, makes him a worthy opponent for John Smith, but it also distorts probably the intention of Powhatan and misreads it. There's a very, a book that's very important, this one called Covered by Night, that just came out recently by Nicole Eustace, who really talks in detail about the kinds of misreadings of speech that occur, and they occur on a kind of fundamental level. They occur on the level of, could give you some examples here, because she's talking about reciprocity and what balanced ideals are for interactions. And her book, Covered by Night, deals with an occasion on 1722 where two white traders kill a Native American man. And she uncovers, and I hate to use this word, deconstructs this event to show that while in order to keep the peace, the white government wants to kill the traders, T-R-A-D-E-R-S, by the way, not traders in the other sense, to appease the Native population, who is the Five Nations of what we would now think of as the Iroquois. And it is not what the Five Nations want. The Five Nations deal with the matter of the death in terms of gifts and ritual denunciations and ritual ways of dealing with the death, but the killing of someone else to account for that. So what this all brings us to, and I hope I haven't run over my time, is that Cooper inherits long-standing confusion in relation to the Native Americans. He does as good a job as he can based on his sources, but we have a kind of fundamental misunderstanding that is rooted in the connection, in the contact zone between the explorers, the discoverers, the settlers, and the Native American tribes. So when we read Cooper, we want to read him through a lens that takes all of this into consideration, and perhaps it understands that what Cooper does for us is give us a story that resonates with us. David Starbuck, who was the archaeologist who studied Fort William Henry, says when he sees enactors, and people are very interested in the massacre at Fort William Henry, he says that Cooper's really responsible for most of the interest in Fort William Henry. So Cooper has made this site. But at the same time, the people who come want their story and their version of the story told. And it's very difficult to mediate all of those versions. So I leave you with more thoughts, perhaps, than conclusions.
Thank you so much. Wonderful. We will now go on to our third presenter, Professor White.
Thank you, David, and good day, everyone. The title of my presentation is The Last of the Mohicans Makes History. For any great American novel, any list of great American novels, James Fenimore Cooper's Last of the Mohicans makes a worthy candidate. No universal criterion for such judgments prevails, so my presentation reveals some familiar literary standards. Published in 1826, Last of the Mohicans was the second of 5 leather stocking tales, all featuring a frontiersman who wears leather stockings or leggings, though each book gives him a special name, in this case, Hawkeye. One common sense guide for judging literature is the classical wisdom that it performs 2 functions, to entertain and to educate, with the balance varying. Most readers admire Cooper's fiction less for its readability and more for titanic characters and heroic themes that inform our national character. Not just national, but international status, however, constitutes a standard for great literature. 2 centuries ago, readers in America and Europe established Cooper as this new nation's first successful career novelist. Mohicans was not Cooper's first acclaimed novel, but it broke out big time, widely translated, never falling out of print, and providing an enduring vision of life on the American frontier and what it means to be an American. This enthusiasm responded to a hunger for images and stories of the New World, but the history of style prepared readers to process Mohicans' depiction of America. The book's characters and settings were a novelty, but its style embodied the literary movement of the time, namely Romanticism, from the late 1700s through mid-1800s, coinciding with Cooper's life from 1789 to 1851. Most simply, Romanticism opposes realism. Realism depicts the hard facts of everyday life. Romanticism escapes such limits, taking you to faraway places or deep within an individual's soul. Romantic fiction in Europe pulled people from their workaday worlds into journeys to wild borderlands where Western civilization met earlier cultures. For instance, Cooper's contemporary, Sir Walter Scott, then the premier British novelist, wrote popular border romances depicting an English gentleman venturing into the Scottish Highlands. Cooper relocated such stories to North America. In The Last of the Mohicans, half-sisters Cora and Alice Munro venture through the wilderness on a quest to join their father, a colonel at Fort William Henry during the French and Indian War, thus the novel's subtitle, A Narrative of 1757. When hostile Indians threatened the sisters' party, 3 rescuers emerge from the forest. One is a well-armed white man, Hawkeye. His companion's a charismatic Indian chief named Chingachgook, whose tribe is all gone save his son, Uncas, the last of the Mohicans. The impact of these characters is still felt around the world, defining the USA's national character, even for people who never heard of James Fenimore Cooper. In Europe, French authors readapted Cooper's scenarios back to Europe, and a German novelist developed a lederhosen leather stocking descended from German-American immigrants. Mohicans also enjoys an afterlife in movies. Millions of Americans who might never read the book learned some of its story through films, most famously 1992's Last of the Mohicans with Daniel Day-Lewis as Hawkeye. FYI, that film's screenplay was based not on the novel, but on a 1936 movie, also titled Last of the Mohicans. Compared to Daniel Day-Lewis, Hawkeye in the book projects 0 love vibes and looks more like an aging homeless person. In any version, this well-armed, sharp-shooting white man, friendly with Native American Indians, became a prototype for the genre of the Western and its many cinematic offshoots, the Lone Ranger and Tonto being the most obvious. Leatherstocking and Chingachgook, as friends of different races on the frontiers of Western civilization, had at least one precedent a century earlier. Robinson Crusoe, shipwrecked on his way to Africa to buy slaves, meets a Caribbean Indian who becomes his Man Friday. Fast forwarding to the 1980s, these biracial tag teams reappeared in buddy movies like 48 Hours or the Lethal Weapon franchise, featuring mismatched white and black detectives. Such cross-cultural male bonding avoids issues raised by interracial hetero couples, a subject still largely off limits for mainstream media. By such historic standards, Mohicans stands as a great American novel, whether you read it or not. But will you read it? The standard for great literature that Cooper and Mohicans doesn't consistently meet is stylistic excellence. The opening movements of Cooper's novels are inspired, and Mohicans has a spectacular ending for those who get that far. Any given page might shine brilliantly with feeling, insight, or action, but all the Leatherstocking tales are long, with extensive dry stretches. For brevity's sake, if Mohicans gives you a headache, get relief from Mark Twain's 1895 satire, Fenimore Cooper's Literary Offenses, which hurts because it's unfair, but also because it's true. So far then, claims to last the Mohicans as a great American novel rest on its expression of national character. But character faces many tests. A popular definition of a classic is a book that won't stay closed, opening to fresh meanings as readers and the times change. When Mohicans debuted 2 centuries ago, Hawkeye as a proto-cowboy and Chingachgook and Uncas as noble savages and vanishing Indians were already old-fashioned and nostalgic. To evaluate the novel's currency, I start by thanking the National Association of Scholars for hosting this event. The NAS website's tab for Issues and Ideals lists higher education's neglect of important books, like Last of the Mohicans, and below that, potential causes for such neglect, including overemphasis on race, gender, and class, and multiculturalism. Such criticisms respond to diversification of reading lists to include women and non-white authors, sometimes squeezing out traditional classics like Mohicans. As a secondary effect, earlier classics are expected to address issues of gender and ethnicity in ways that respect emergent identities. Mohicans' meeting of such standards relates to NAS's mission. Cooper's reputation is as a conservative writer, partly from his early appearance in history and depictions of earlier times, but also for biographical reasons. During the American Revolution, Cooper's father rose from a modest background to become a wealthy land developer, notably of Cooperstown, New York, now home of the Baseball Hall of Fame. Cooper Sr. joined the Federalist elite as a U.S. representative and raised his son James in the manner of a young aristocrat. Later, during the Jacksonian era, Cooper wasted time and effort suing townspeople and journalists he regarded as inferiors, disrespecting his privileges. One way to describe his situation is he enjoyed the benefits of the American Revolution, but wanted it to stop when and where it suited him. Comparatively, in Last of the Mohicans, Hawkeye rants against civilization's destruction of the wilderness, but treasures the advanced weaponry invented by that same civilization, which also delivered his ancestors from Europe to America. Hawkeye also boasts repeatedly that he is a man without a cross in his blood, distancing himself from a fact of life on the frontier. Today, a cross in the blood would refer to mixed race birth or identity. Chingachgook, too, is unmixed, a full-blooded Mohican whose late wife, the last pure Mohican woman, was mother to Uncas, himself the last of the Mohicans, because no woman can now provide exclusively Mohican DNA. This dilemma propels the novel's most stirring episodes when Uncas helps rescue the Monroe sisters, and he and Cora become, at a chaste distance, the leading couple of Last of the Mohicans. In the 1992 movie, it's a hunky young Hawkeye who hooks up with Cora, while Uncas is a teenager exchanging glances with Cora's junior half-sister, blonde-haired Alice. In the novel, Alice's mother was from the Colonel's home country of Scotland, but Cora's mother was from the Caribbean and partly descended from enslaved people. Thus, any potential child of Cora and Uncas would combine the major races of post-Columbian America: Indian, European, African, a different American than Hawkeye, and a challenge to attitudes that races are pure, permanent, and separate. Like Uncas, Cora could find no spouse in her own society. Entering the wilderness, however, liberates her from such limits. To avoid the complications of Cora's and Uncas's relationship, Cooper follows Shakespeare's resolution for Romeo and Juliet by having them perish in a final rescue attempt. At the end, Hawkeye and Chingachgook are the only interracial couple left standing. History complicates such resolutions. The Mohicans did not disappear. Under a more historically accurate name, they are the federally recognized tribe called Mohegan. Like most Indian peoples, they survived on the edges of American society, often sired by absent white fathers or marrying Black people, most of them with their own share of European DNA. Like nearly all Native Americans today, the Mohegans are a mixed people, genetically the children of Cora and Uncas. Comparably, New England's largest amusement center is the Mohegan Sun in Uncasville, Connecticut. These Mohegans are not noble savages fleeing civilization. They're using the house's money to send young people to law school to protect their rights and treaties. The novel's conclusion inevitably reinforces Cooper's old school reputation, but concocting some happy ending for Cora and Uncas might have led readers or publishers to reject the novel, and we wouldn't be discussing it. Cooper's range of choices exemplifies a quandary facing all of us who inherit the permanent American Revolution. Faced with inevitable change, do we advance, ignore, obstruct, or manage it? When the civilization that gave some of us affluence and citizenship redistributes these gifts, do we resist or see where change takes us? Many members of NAS might speak more comprehensively on what lessons Last of the Mohicans models. Not exactly William F. Buckley Jr. defining conservative as one who stands athwart history yelling stop, I suggest, nor recent campaigns to roll back history to a more privileged past. Cooper's birth in the late 1700s situates him closer to the classic conservatism of Edmund Burke, which supports society's organic development and its reform to accommodate self-evident facts, without, however, sacrificing traditional structures and beliefs which, regardless whether they are entirely or empirically true, also endure, like the Last of the Mohicans. Well, thank you.
Thank you. Let's see. So thank you very much. And we now have going on to questions and answers. Not questions and answers. We're going to the Q&A button and the chat. And people who are watching this, please feel free to add questions of your own. Let's see. We have a question from Gary, which is somewhat terse. Can you comment on the early use of hybridity? Does anybody want to take an answer, a stab at that?
I could chip in a little bit. I believe Craig said some good things about that too, in terms of the makeup of Natty Bumppo's character. I think, in that sense, Cooper is dealing with cultural hybridity, where Hawkeye or Natty emphasizes that he's a man without a cross. He's of pure blood, so to speak. And yet kind of the appeal of his whole persona is that he's brought up among the Mohicans and absorbs many of their ways. He knows the forest and the frontier so much better than any of the white settlers. And so in that respect, Cooper speaks of this kind of cultural hybridity in the novel, of which Natty, throughout the Leatherstocking Tales, stands as this kind of intermediary between white culture and native culture. But he also deals with racial hybridity, especially in the person of Cora Monroe. And I appreciated Craig's additional remarks on her. But, somebody who essentially bears a sort of curse by society, a stigma by society, that's not reflected in her character. I mean, she's a bold character. She's forthright. She's beautiful even. She's got physical attraction there. And she stands really as a more active kind of representative of women than her sister, her half-sister Alice does, who is more the kind of fainting, frail sort of stereotype. It appears that Cora is much better set up to sort of weather the difficulties of the journey that they undertake on the frontier. And so it's interesting in that regard that Cooper holds this out. And as I think we've discussed with the ending there's some ambiguity as to where Cooper heads with that. In some ways, it's sort of an inevitable lot in America that this mixing occurs. And yet the questions kind of emerged. Was Cooper in favor of that? Was Cooper opposed to that? I think I tend to read the novel as essentially embracing the idea, although I would say, sometimes in reality, Cooper maybe wasn't as comfortable with just, the actualities of what sometimes occurred. But yet I think he holds up this possibility that America could be a place where people can mix in these ways. And that's essentially kind of a matter of fact, sort of happenstance that as you wander through America, you will encounter people of all sorts of different looks, different ethnicities, different racial mixtures, and so forth.
Thank you.
I'll chip in that when I was in the Boy Scouts, one instruction I got was that if you're in the woods without water, drink from where two streams meet, because they energize and purify each other. And what Stephen was saying made me think of that the two most dynamic characters and the two most with the most powerful speech in Last of the Mohicans are these hybrid characters, one of whom is Hawkeye, who in that quote I was saying of a man without a cross in his blood, he continues, though I have lived so long among the Redskins as to be suspected. So he's conscious of this hybrid nature. And and coincidentally, yesterday I met with another fellow who reads and but who hadn't read Last of the Mohicans, but he was telling me how much he liked the 1992 movie, but he didn't buy into Daniel Day-Lewis playing Hawkeye because Daniel Day-Lewis is not an American Indian. And, you know, but Hawkeye's not an American Indian, I had to say, and everything. But going on to Cora, she, she's not just liberated from in issues of marriage, but in terms of leadership. And at several points in the story, she really commands the action to the extent that that Hawkeye and Chingachgook and Uncas and Major Hayward just implicitly obey her, and so on. And so that she assumes this status of leadership, especially in the wilderness, away from society, in a way that could not be imagined if she were on the Eastern Seaboard, for instance.
Well, you know, one of the questions that when we talk about cultural hybridity, I was struck in the novel by the fact that you have all of these different cultures running around. Why we emphasize this is a sign of Cooper's preoccupation. We've got Monroe, a Scotsman who, as you know, most good English in the period would find completely inferior. We have the French. We have the Dutch. So what we have is a kind of myopia about cultural hybridity here. And I was struck by the fact that this is in fact a moment of cultural hybridity for America. So what we have to ask ourselves is, why is the emphasis put there? And what does this say? Why do we have these oppositions in this? And the question, of course, and when we talk about cultural hybridity, you know, I would hesitate that anybody besides the Queen of England, who could probably trace her ancestry back among us, can say that we are culturally pure in any way. And so this question is a question of cultural construction, not necessarily a question of fact.
I have a question about something which is, I think, underemphasized in the novel, current discussions. David Gamet, the singing teacher, he's a wonderful Ichabod Crane, a parody of a ridiculous, overeducated New Englander. Perhaps he'd become a professor in some future generation. Has that been forgotten? Does that speak to modern America? Why actually was that figure so important at the time that you have this extended parody of this well-meaning fool, who I suppose isn't just a fool, but why is the New England figure so important in this story of the American frontier? To any and all.
I mean, one thing I would say is that, first of all, Cooper had a rivalry of Yorkers and Yankees, that he distrusted New Englanders for quite some time. And part of his sense of that was that they had this sort of externalized piety. And later in the century, that would manifest itself in things like temperance groups, abolitionist societies, whatever the social cause. Cooper sort of chuckled at that and the whole idea of philanthropists generally throughout his career as being people that might have maybe a little bit more self-serving motivation than they might let on to. But I think also he's just having some fun with giving us a character that's so utterly out of place in the wilderness. I mean, part of what is so funny about David Gamet at first is that he's out on the frontier and just very unwilling to change much of anything about his approach to suit the conditions. And there's that kind of comic mismatch that happens there. Later on, he goes almost to another extreme, and it's like he's kind of, quote unquote, going native, so to speak. in his subsequent adventures. But either way, he doesn't quite know how to steer this good middle course. And I think some of the hilarity just comes from his ineptness and his out of placeness there. He reflects in some ways on Major Hayward, who also sticks out a little bit, but Major Hayward has the gentleman's sensibility to sort of adapt and improvise. He's got much more equipment to kind of shore up under that. But I think for the modern reader, maybe I still find David Gamet to be very comic, but I wonder if readers today see him as quite as hilarious as maybe he might have been in that time.
Well, let me build a little on what Stephen has said, in that, of course, Ichabod Crane is a production of Washington Irving, also a New Yorker. And as you remember from the legend of Sleepy Hollow, the Dutch were pitted against the Sleepy Dutch, who represent New York in that, are pitted against the all-consuming nature of the Puritans, exemplified by Ichabod Crane. But here, what I find interesting is David Gamet represents culture. He represents the continuation of not only culture, but biblical culture. He also is referred to by a Jewish name. There are comments about that, his being Old Testament in nature. So he exists in that point because he's, everybody likes to make fun of an academic. Everybody likes to make fun of someone who's learned. And that hilarity toward those kinds of characters continues to exist. Also, there is much in the novel that is being made of musicality, both the music of nature, the music of Uncas's speech is one of the startling moments there. And the fact that music can tame and exist in that context. So he's a very hybrid character who's there for a variety of reasons. And again, a comic character, you have to have a bottom in Shakespeare. You have to have someone to make fun of. And it seems to me that in America, it's going to be the person of some degree of learning.
I don't have very far to go to increase or improve the comments so far, except that my one regret about David Gamet is that Cooper drops him at the end. And I think the last image of him is that he's dressed pretty much like an Indian, and he's throwing rocks from from a precipice, which backs up the allusion to King David, of course. But then in the denouement of the novel, he is not accounted for. So David Randall, I think that one of the reasons that that critics don't resolve David Gamet is that Cooper sort of doesn't resolve him either.
The author I blame the author. Let's see, I'm going to have another question about character, since this isn't actually, I gather this isn't what Cooper is best known for, is the fine characterization, but what is the best character in this novel and why? And I'm just going to throw out, is Magua the best character simply because a good villain is always lots of fun and worth reading? Or if not him, who is the best character, and what about in the way Cooper delineates that character makes that the best character? You can have more than one, I suppose, as an answer. To any and all.
Well, I'll jump in, because I think what you don't have in Cooper is character. You have characterization, and maybe perhaps you have stereotype. I think what you have is the most successful character, of course, is Hawkeye, because Hawkeye delineates what the American national character has to be. following on Krevker, he smells of the woods. His nature and language is of the American landscape. And his is the identification of the European with the American landscape. He's the melding of that, which makes him the most successful character in the novel, from my point of view.
Everybody with that, or are we going to have any alternate theories?
Well, I'll stay with Cora as the most brilliant character, but also and I'm sorry, I'm not meaning to continually gripe about Cooper's lapses, but the greatest problem with the novel, as far as I'm concerned, is the many chapters in the second half of the novel in which she does not appear after she's been captured at the massacre at Fort William Henry. There are lots of chapters of the rest of the party gathering their forces and trying to track her down and so on. And when she reappears, maybe 3 or 4 chapters from the end, the novel just catches fire all over again. That is, it just comes to life again with her reappearance. But in defense of Magua, I think we really haven't paid attention to him, and he is a quite hybrid character already in terms of the fact that he is a Huron who has been expelled from his tribe. And I'm not sure I recall all the reasons, but it may have had something to do with his drunkenness and his flogging by Colonel Monroe at one point. But anyway, now he's an Iroquois and a chief and so on. And so he really does cross a lot of lines. And he himself falls in love with Cora, it appears. Or if that overstates it, he at least has a high regard for her at the end and appears to regret her slaying by one of his associates at the end. So he is quite a dynamic character throughout.
And Professor Harthorn?
I think I have my temptations as to how to answer that. But one of the things I really enjoy about the novel is that even though Cooper is not out to, create a very Henry James-like complicated, super well-rounded portrayal of character in there. I mean, he's more focused on incident, for instance. I like Doreen's comment about characterization. The characters kind of play roles, and in that sense, I often feel kind of reminded of the sort of thing Charles Dickens did so well in that regard, where Charles Dickens could take a very flat character and yet give that character dimension and life, bring Mr. Micawber to stand out so much in David Copperfield, for instance. One of the things I think Cooper does so well in Last of the Mohicans is that he's willing to create these characters that even if they do play a particular role in the story, he's not making them wholly good, wholly bad. Magua has his complex motivations. Cora, I think, sort of stands out from the stereotype that she might be under. And even Hawkeye, I think, stands as kind of a model, but we're already familiar with him from the Pioneers, where it's very clear that he's on sort of the fringes. He's on the margins of civilization, and he kind of represents the way America could go with that sort of frontier atmosphere, having that in his blood, absorbing the best from white culture and native culture, although he's illiterate, so maybe he's not getting the whole picture. But in that regard, he's somebody who is on the margins. And it's interesting just how many characters Cooper puts in this book that are interesting in that regard, that this isn't a book that necessarily revolves around one idealized character or one single villain. He does a really good job with the composite cast here in allowing us to kind of bounce the dimensions of, I guess, sort of pre-America off each other in that story.
Thank you. I'm going to switch from here to a question by Charlie Sears. Mr. Sears, if I've mispronounced your last name, please forgive me. Which is, and I'm going to build on it actually, do you believe modern readers will have difficulty enjoying the book because they have no context of history in the first place? And I want to make that personal. When you teach the book, the three of you, what do your students, get without, the benefit of teaching? And what is it that you as teachers provide in terms of the historical context? And I guess, and how successful is the different sorts of things you introduce for historical context to your students? I guess modern readers is sort of this abstraction, so I want to particularize that to your students, to any and all. Professor Harthorn, you're nodding. I'll make you answer first.
Sure. I think getting the students into the style is a challenge. And I actually heard somebody say once, if you start in chapter 2 and then go back and read chapter 1 later, you'll be a little bit more absorbed in the story. Cooper's very formal getting us off to a start. And I think just sort of orienting the students to that, telling them to stick it out. I find once they're into the story proper, things are much better going. And the comment that I often get from my students is, oh, I was led to expect something really dreadful, and this is actually really engaging. So, once you kind of account for the formal style of it, the way Cooper sort of intervenes as an omniscient narrator there, and will often comment on the action, it's definitely an acquired taste. But I find that students can get in and sort of engage with the characters fairly immediately and get involved in the action and see some of the dimensions of that. I find that I have to maybe steer them a little bit into sort of wading through some of the cultural dimensions. And I often will give them passages from John Heckewelder's writings so they can actually see some of his, I guess I would say, early anthropological kinds of studies, and how Cooper's drawing on those sources and transforming those sources. So many times people get kind of caught up on that question of, is this accurate or not? But I tend to kind of steer my students to think about what's Cooper doing with this raw material. He's really taking Heckewelder, who I think he viewed as a good source, somebody who was a serious student of Native American culture, but yet see how Cooper takes Heckewelder and turns it into something else. That's kind of where some of our fun is, to see how Cooper is really constructing this pretty amazing epic out of just raw materials of history that he's picking up here and there. He's seeing the possibilities in this material. Heckewelder's writing about Native culture, but Heckewelder doesn't have this kind of grand narrative that deals with the destiny of America. So, what Cooper saw in that, how he transformed that, is something that I think the students, once they kind of wrestle with, now I can see sort of the profound nature of what Cooper does as an artist.
Professor Saar, may I go to you on this one?
Oh, sure. Well, I have to be honest, I prefer to teach the pioneers. I find the pioneers actually raises questions that my students deal with more directly. One of the issues, of course, with being a classic, and this is the same issue that you have with things like the Scarlet Letter, is that students have seen these things before, possibly in a high school class. So their interest is dulled by the memory of what they have experienced, sometimes not entirely good. So that when you come on material that is fresher to them, they're much more receptive. Now, the question of history, I think we have, in general, not as good a sense of historical knowledge as we once did. I think that's a problem in the culture. I think that that's an issue that, runs through all parts of the culture. And I think that we need, when we teach anything, to really explain what the background of that is, both intellectual and in particular.
Thank you. Professor White?
First, I wanted to appreciate the comments about the difficulties of the first chapter, but also to turn them that later on that ends up the problems of the first chapter, that very grand scale God's eye view of the scenario ends up being one of the things students like best. If there's one dimension of Cooper's style that students tended to respond well to, it was frequently his opening paragraphs for each chapter, which are often quite cinematic in terms of their scope and span. And certainly our students, Doreen, you're right that the students don't come in with a lot of history, but they do come in having seen a lot of movies. And so they like the parts of Cooper's style that seem almost to anticipate cinema. And one other historical relationship is that Cooper's book, and specifically Last Mohicans, inspired a lot of paintings that were popular at the time, like by Thomas Cole, the founder of the Hudson River School. So there is almost like a cinematic quality 100 years before the medium is popular. In terms of the history, the main advantage I found was if I found some opportunity to introduce the Indian tribes, or that is the Indian language groups, that is the Algonquians, who Chingachgook and Uncas represent, and then the Iroquoian peoples, the Haudenosaunee, whom Magua at least represents for on the spot. And so if they can sort of become aware of first the differences among Indian peoples, and then how those differences contributed to and responded to the struggles between the English and the French in the French and Indian War, then they do start getting a sense of the forces at work at this point. The great difficulty is that the French and Indian War, along with the U.S.-Mexican War, is one of those forgotten wars of the United States. And I find myself very grateful for that one footnote that Cooper provides, in which he refers to I can't remember Washington's rank at the time, but he refers to George Washington's actions during the French and Indian War. And at last, a little bit of traction for the students in the French and Indian War.
Also, actually, so is a historical novel then quintessentially something for an amnesia culture? Is it very American to, look, I know it's Walter Scott and all, but is it very American to write something presuming that people have already forgotten their past and therefore you need to remind them about it? So actually, was it already forgotten at the time? I mean, it was, after all, set, several generations beforehand. How much of this was already a resurrection of the past for the amnesiac Americans of the 1820s?
I mean, I would argue that that's part of the premise. And like I was talking earlier about the blockhouse or the bloody pond, part of the problem that Cooper sees in America is that it's a new country, but there's so much of a focus on newness. He complained in terms of being a writer of historical fiction that, of course, America didn't have the kind of historical materials that you might find in Europe, old castles or things from centuries ago. But yeah, he's kind of realizing it's not that it's not there. It's just we don't have the remnants of it anymore. We don't necessarily have all the visual reminders of it around us. And so it's so easy to put that out of our minds and forget. And I think that's part of part of one of the central arguments in Mohicans is about that idea of just kind of remembering what America was and borrowing from that to think about where America could be or where America is going.
Professor White?
Oh, well, the recent
yeah,
passing, the recent passing of Hilary Mantel made me think about how the English are suddenly much more aware of Thomas Cromwell and that he's not Oliver Cromwell. And so to a great extent, people do learn their history, or many more people will know about the French and Indian War by being aware of the movie or the book of Last of the Mohicans than will remember it from their history classes. And I really liked, I think, Doreen, did you bring up that people who go to Fort William Henry won't, they come with an idea of what should have happened. In any case, the massacre at Fort William Henry, if there was one part that students were fixed on, it was that, largely because it is an extremely cinematic episode. That is, it has a very wide span, and then it focuses so closely on the woman and her baby, being attacked by an Indian and so on. So that, so suddenly you have this human connection to a moment in history that history books and history courses, that they work for a certain number of people in the society all the time. But if you want more people to know about the French and Indian War, they'll know it through Last of the Mohicans.
I'm going to pick up on something that Craig said, because one of the striking images, what do we remember? We don't remember the massacre. We don't remember how many people were killed. And that image of the child being dashed against the tree stands out. It turns out, of course, that this is taken from the captivity narrative of Hannah Dunstan. And this is a metaphor that runs throughout American history. And interestingly enough, it has been raised against the Spanish conquistadors. So that metaphor, that particular image of babies being hit against trees, seems to be something that recurs in commentaries on war, and it rivets people, no matter what you want. And it also occurs, when I was researching this, there's much of this in Vietnam, in accounts of Vietnam. So if you want people to notice a war, dash a baby against a tree.
How to? Okay. Thank you for that practical advice for our future war journalism. I'm going to say on that enlightening note, it would be wonderful if I could have some concluding remarks from each of you, because I think we're getting up to our time. Thank you all. Might I have a concluding remark of a minute or so from each of you, perhaps in reverse alphabetical order this time. Professor White first.
Okay, thank you, David. I wanted to ask pardon if references to our nation's permanent revolution sounded provocative. I don't mean to connect them with Leninism or Maoism. The phrase might as well refer to modernity, since the Renaissance and discovery of America with the USA as the hyper-modern nation. And I want to close by relating that notion to another enduring legacy from the Last of the Mohicans. If acquaintances fall into conversations with me about James Fenimore Cooper, some remember reading Twain's literary offenses, but only a few remember or will come up with a book title. When I mention The Last of the Mohicans, though, fairly everyone immediately says, I've heard of that. The Last of the Mohicans rings in our ears like a trumpet, but putting aside familiarity with the book, how many know what a Mohican is or ever heard the word used anywhere else? As with Westerns and buddy movies, this wide familiarity testifies to the novel's roots in our national culture. Last of the Mohicans constitutes a folk saying, a meme or idiom that English speakers process without knowing in its reference, while also knowing what it means, like kick the bucket, whose meaning we know, but wherefore bucket? You all now know more about what Last of the Mohicans means than most of your acquaintances will want to hear, but for those for whom the book might as well not exist, what does the phrase mean to them? One surprising place the phrase recurs is sports news. With some regularity, young professionals asked to comment on the retirement of a league veteran will commend the retiree for his discipline, leadership, and teamwork before saying of the venerable 30-something, he's like the last of the Mohicans. In brief, the phrase marks the passing of a generation devoted to heroic old ways, which in the nature of human life are always passing, but in modern culture, even faster. In the past, we glimpse a beauty that perhaps never was, but might have been, and lives even yet in regret and possibility. Cooper's novel is The Last of the Mohicans. You be one too. Read it.
Thank you very much, Professor Saar.
Well, I can hardly do as well as Craig has done on this. I think I come at this a little differently. I am an avid novel reader and have read every novel I could possibly get my hands on at all times. But The Last of the Mohicans and Fenimore Cooper, and I think the point is that some stories slip into our consciousness, into the consciousness of the culture. And they speak to something that we don't quite understand. So Pocahontas, for example, the Headless Horseman, The Last of the Mohicans. Why do these exist in various forms and avatars? Why do they continue even when the source is lost? And I think what we've done today is to start to sort of talk about what the origin portion of this, and perhaps how our culture creates and recreates history at each moment in time. So I think that The Last of the Mohicans, and I think I really have enjoyed doing this. So thank you for the opportunity. And thank you for the nice conversation with two much more learned people than I.
Thank you. Well, and thank you. And I'm going to go from that thank you to Professor Harthorn.
Thank you. Yeah, I think we're all just educated in different ways. So I've enjoyed the conversation, just the different perspectives that we've had. It's kind of interesting to think about Cooper's legacy in the 20th century. And one small but interesting aspect of that is that during the early days of Nazism, there were Jews that were essentially, they're actually songs and works that they created where they were essentially fearing that they might become the last of the Mohicans, that, they saw kind of the direction that the discrimination, later, what would become the Holocaust might take. And they feared that they would be essentially snuffed out. And German culture anyway had this huge fascination with Cooper's romances. But another line of influence was also a German writer by the name of Karl May, ended up writing his own frontier stories, very inspired by Cooper. Those would go on to inspire people like Wagner, and another great fan of Karl May's works was Adolf Hitler. And so it's interesting that if you look at something like the Holocaust, you had people really on both sides of the fence seeing aspects in Cooper's work where they thought, this is kind of where I want to latch on. And it's interesting to me that the legacy of Cooper and The Last of the Mohicans is really kind of contested in that way as well. That Cooper has certain things that vibrate well with different aspects of our culture of different stripes. And I have, friends who argue very strenuously that Cooper is on, one side or another of the political vibe as we see it today. And yet I think Cooper kind of steered his own course in interesting ways. I love The Last of the Mohicans in part because it's an elegy, and I think of it kind of standing in the place of other great works of literature like Beowulf, where, again, with Beowulf, you see this life of a great hero, and yet it's one that is doomed. Beowulf ends up dying in this very valiant fight with the dragon, and as that great epic closes, his people are left leaderless without a great hero there, and yet they reflect on his great valor and power and so forth. There's a sense that something great has been lost, and in that sense, Cooper strikes a similar kind of note, looking back at America and kind of wondering what, and this sad that this turned out. But he also is somebody who looks and thinks about great possibilities there. So I think of him as a writer who can really speak across different times. Different people have really looked to him for inspiration in many ways. And I think the challenge is just getting people past reading Mark Twain, who distorts Cooper quite a bit, and getting people to actually see Cooper dealing with some of these complexities of history. I think he's a serious student of history, but one who also saw, bigger artistic possibilities in there, and just that kind of play that he has of, looking back with knowledge and insight, but also an attempt to try to capture what's fascinating, what's important here. I think he's just a really master storyteller who was always he always had one great idea in mind. The next best thing he was going to do was always it was always going to be his best work. Cooper is such a pioneer, not just in the story of the frontier. He's the creator of the sea novel, and somebody who just was always trying out new possibilities in fiction. So my advice for people who might dip into Last Mohicans, I would say, don't stop there. See where else Cooper takes you. I saw a reference in the questions to Catherine Mariah Sedgwick's novel, Hope Leslie, which is set in the 17th century. If you want a really great counterpart to Cooper's Leatherstocking Tales, that's not a Leatherstocking Tale, I recommend his 1829 novel, The Wept of Wishton Wish, which deals with Puritan settlers in Connecticut and some of the interesting relationships that they have with Native Americans too.
Thank you so much. All right, it's on my to-do list. Thank you all so very much. And thank you to the audience. We do this for you, and we can't do it without you. So I'm just going to have some last little bits to say. First off, again, questions not answered, please send them to me, randall@nas.org. I'll be delighted to forward them to our panelists so they can have the option to answer you. This will be up within 24 hours on the National Association of Scholars YouTube channel. Plugs. You can become a member of the National Association of Scholars. We do stuff like this, and indeed, look at our issues and ideals pages and see if you enjoy and support what we're doing. So that's the development plug. What we're doing for our webinars coming forward. We have in our same series coming up, we have a webinar on Taipei, October 25th, and Herman Melville, and we have The Sun Also Rises on November 8th. Those are our next two in our Great American Literature webinar. We also have an Ages of American Invention history. We're doing the Age of Automation. That's next one is going to be on October 18th, 1 week from now. So this is the plug for coming soon on the same channel. And we strive as at all possible to make future webinars hit the standard of this one. So thank you all again so very much.